if Brazil brought in way more African slaves than the US or Haiti, why doesn't Brazil have a bigger black or African origin population now? Was forced racial mixing a big reason for that? Right. So if you look at the number of, so we had some, there was something called the transatlantic slave trade. Let's look at the map. Let us look at the map and understand what this transatlantic slave trade was. So here we have the map. Now we're going to go to the Atlantic region near the equator. Okay, not the North Atlantic, not the South Atlantic, but the region near the equator. And it's around this region, around here, that you had the transatlantic slave trade. So Africans were captured in West Africa, and they were shipped across the Atlantic, and they were then sold in various parts of the Americas, whether it was the present day United States or Brazil or other territories. That's what happened. Now the question is, how many slaves did these regions acquire from Africa? If you look at the United States, it's the official figures are less than 500,000 slaves were shipped or were received alive in the United States over time. 500,000 slaves, African origin, black slaves in the US. When it comes to Brazil, it's like 5 million plus. So Brazil acquired 10 times, more than 10 times the number of slaves the Americans, the United States, present day United States, acquired. So Brazil brought in like more than 10 times the number of slaves, African slaves, than the US, and more than 5 times the number of slaves that were brought into Haiti after the destruction of the Dominican, the people who once lived in Hispaniola, the Carib people, the Arawak people. Different story. So, if that is the case, why doesn't Brazil have a much larger black population today? So here's the deal. According to official records, less than 500,000 black slaves were shipped to the United States. But those slaves were treated, you would say, in a way that was not gonna kill them, if it makes any sense. Look, the slaves were treated as goods. They were treated no different from livestock animals like cattle or pigs or whatever. That's how slaves were treated. They were not treated as human beings by the Europeans. Utterly barbaric practice, right? But when it comes to the treatment of, let's say, animals, there's different ways of treating animals. If you treat them in a certain way, they will thrive and they will reproduce and they will do well, as long as you want to keep them alive. But if you treat animals poorly, animals die, right? So in the United States, slaves were given the kind of living standards where they were treated very harshly, but they were not killed, and they were able to form families and reproduce, and their population actually increased over time. In Brazil, it was the other way around. The treatment was extremely harsh, and the mortality rate was very high. In the United States, the mortality rate was relatively much lower. So in Brazil, you had extremely harsh treatment of the African slaves. So African slaves were shipped to Brazil beginning in the 1500s, the first half of the 1500s, the first half of the 16th century. And by the 1800s, more than 5 million African origin slaves were shipped to Brazil, and they were put to work in cotton plantations, sugar plantations, then diamond mines and other mines were discovered. They were put to work in those mines, and the treatment was extremely harsh. The mortality was extremely high. It was just brutal. It was barbaric. And eventually, by 1888 or somewhere around that time, slavery was officially abolished in Brazil. But the slaves who were freed now, they were given no option to survive. So they were not given any kind of remuneration. They were not given any vocation. They were not given any land that they could work on. They were given no compensation. So very quickly they found themselves in situations that very much mimicked slavery once again. And after 1888, or whichever year it was that slavery was abolished, the Brazilian government then began this policy of encouraging large scale European settlement in Brazil to whiten the population. So being black was regarded as a stigma. It was regarded as something very inferior. And over time, the populations mixed. So the black people would originally, uh, you know, procreate, let's say, or have children with the native people of Brazil, and eventually that got mixed with the white populations also. So if you see the official Brazilian statistics today, I would imagine that less than 10% of the people of Brazil regard themselves as black, or identify as black. So in Brazil, how is race determined? Race is determined by what the person decides that their race is. So most people say that we are not black. We are of mixed ancestry or whatever, but not black. And that's why most people are regarded as not black. But if you look at the actual parentage and ancestry and heritage of most of the Brazilian people, at least half of them have African ancestry, right? So that is what happened.